packed one bag. That's it. One duffel bag with 2 pairs of jeans, a hoodie, my retainer that I hadn't worn in months, and $43 I'd saved from babysitting the Hendersons' kids down the street. My brother stood in the doorway of my bedroom watching me pack like he was a security guard making sure I didn't steal anything on my way out. He was 26. I was 20. I didn't cry. I wanted to. My throat felt like someone had their hand around it, squeezing slow. But I didn't cry because I knew that was what they wanted. They wanted me to fall apart on their hardwood floors so they could feel powerful. So I zipped the bag, picked it up, and walked past my brother without looking at him. My mother was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her coffee, looking out the window at the backyard. She didn't turn around when I walked through. I said goodbye anyway. She didn't answer. I closed the front door behind me and stood on the porch of the house I'd grown up in Naperville, Illinois, in February, and the cold hit me like a wall. I had nowhere to go. I had $43. I had a community college acceptance letter folded in my jacket pocket that I hadn't told them about yet because I'd been saving it, this small, hopeful thing, waiting for the right moment. There was never going to be a right moment. I understand that now. I want to tell you what I did wrong. Because I think people who hear stories like mine assume the person telling it is a saint. I wasn't. I was 20 years old and I'd made a mess of things in my own way. I dropped out of my first semester at U of I after 3 months because I was miserable and I hadn't told my parents until the refund window closed. I'd been working at a restaurant, saving money, trying to figure out my next step. My brother had found out through a friend of his who knew someone in my dorm. He told my parents before I could. That was the reason. Not drugs, not crime, not anything dangerous. I'd quietly dropped out of a college I hated and was trying to regroup. And for that, my mother told me I was a disappointment to everything they'd worked for. And my brother stood in my doorway and watched me pack my bag. My father was the interesting one. He didn't say a word during any of it. He sat in his recliner in the living room with the TV on, some cable news program, and when I passed through on my way out, he looked at me for a second and then looked back at the screen. That look said everything. It said, I agree with them. It said, you're on your own. It said, don't come back until you're worth something. I walked 6 blocks to a coffee shop called Grounds and Glory and sat in a booth for 2 hours until my fingers stopped feeling numb. I called my friend Petra, who was renting a room in a shared house in Wicker Park with 4 other people. She said I could sleep on her floor for 2 weeks, maybe 3, and that I'd have to be out by the time her boyfriend visited because he didn't like having extra people around. I said okay. I meant it gratefully. I want to tell you what those first weeks were like, but I also don't because dwelling on rock bottom serves nothing except the people who pushed you there. So I'll give you the shape of it, a sleeping bag on Petra's floor, a job at a sandwich shop downtown, a bus pass I could barely afford, and a community college brochure I kept rereading on slow afternoons. The acceptance letter had been for Harper College. I called them to ask if I could defer. They said yes. I cried exactly once, in a bathroom stall at work, on a Tuesday in March. One time. Then I got back to work. Here is what I figured out about myself in that period. I was good with numbers. Not just good fast. The kind of fast that makes your manager stop by your register and watch because it doesn't seem right that you can do that without a calculator. The restaurant I was working at used a paper system for their inventory and it was a disaster, leaking money in ways nobody could see clearly. I started keeping my own parallel records in a spiral notebook during slow hours, not because anyone asked me to, but because it bothered me. The waste bothered me. After 6 weeks, I showed the manager what I'd found. He stared at the notebook for a long time and then said, "How did you catch that?" I said, "Numbers leave trails. You just have to follow them." He gave me a small raise and a new responsibility. I was 19. I kept the notebook. I enrolled at Harper that fall. Accounting, not because someone told me to, not because it was prestigious, but because I had discovered a genuine love for the way a balance sheet tells the truth. You cannot hide in a balance sheet. Every lie eventually shows up somewhere. There's something deeply satisfying about that, especially when you've been surrounded by people who are very comfortable lying. I graduated with honors 3 years later, transferred to DePaul for my bachelor's, graduated, Got a job at a mid-size accounting firm in the Loop. I was 25. I had a studio apartment in Logan Square with exactly enough room for a bed, a desk, and a bookcase. I bought a plant. I named her something embarrassing that I won't repeat here. She's still alive. I had not spoken to my mother, my brother, or my father since the day I walked out of that house in Naperville. This is the part of the story people want me to be sad about. They want me to say I spent those yearning, reaching out, driving past the house. I didn't. I was too busy. And also, I had people. Petra became one of my closest friends. I found a community through a running group that met in Humboldt Park on Sunday mornings. I found a therapist named Dr. Okafor who had a very calming way of saying uncomfortable things out loud until they stopped having power over me. I found, slowly, over years, what I can only describe as a life that was entirely mine, not inherited, not performed for anyone. Mine. The first real test came when I was 27. I was working at the firm, doing well, moving up, when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize with a 630 area code, Naperville. I almost didn't pick up. I did. It was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, who had always moved quietly through family events, never creating conflict, never really siding with anyone. She told me my father had had a health scare. Nothing fatal, she said quickly, but significant. She said my mother was struggling. She said she thought I should know. I thanked her. I said I appreciated the call. I told her I hoped my father recovered well. I hung up and sat at my desk for about 10 minutes doing nothing, just feeling the weight of it. Not grief, exactly. Something more complicated than grief. The feeling of caring about people who stopped treating you like a person. I didn't call, I sent a card. One of those plain white ones with just a small printed flower on the front. I wrote inside, I hope your recovery goes smoothly. I signed my name. I mailed it from the post office near my apartment. My therapist and I talked about it for several sessions. She never told me what to do. She just kept asking what I actually wanted underneath the obligation, underneath the guilt. What did I actually want? It took me a long time to answer that honestly. What I wanted was an apology. Not a big dramatic one. Not a speech. Just an acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. 2 words would have done it. I'm sorry. That's all I needed. And it never came. When I was 29, I started my own bookkeeping business on the side. Small clients at first. A barber shop, a yoga studio, a food truck collective. I did their books evenings and weekends. Within 14 months, I left the firm. Within 2 years, I had 12 clients and had hired my first contractor. I was 31. By 33, I had a proper small business, 5 employees, an office in Pilsen that I loved, and a client base that included several mid-sized companies in the Chicago metro area. I also owned a 2-bedroom condo in Andersonville that I had bought myself with my own money that no one had given me or co-signed for or helped me manage. I had done that alone, with the $43 and the sleeping bag and the spiral notebook as my entire inheritance. I am not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what the knock on my door meant when it finally came. I had just gotten home from work on a Thursday evening in October. I had takeout from a Thai place 2 blocks away. I was still in my work clothes, gray slacks, a blue blouse, because I'd had a long day with a client audit that had run over. I was pouring water into a glass when I heard the buzzer from the lobby. I wasn't expecting anyone. I assumed it was a delivery, a wrong apartment, something mundane. I pressed the intercom and said, yes. It was my mother's voice. I stood very still for a moment with the water glass in my hand. She said my name. Then she said, your brother is here too. Then she said, we need to talk to you. Can you let us up? 13 years. No phone calls. No letters. No response to the card I sent. 13 years of complete silence, and now, on a Thursday in October, standing in my lobby with my brother, she needed to talk. I thought about a lot of things in those 10 seconds. I thought about the duffel bag. I thought about Petra's floor. I thought about the bus pass in the sandwich shop and the bathroom stall where I cried once and then got back to work. I thought about the card I sent that got no response. I thought about what Dr. Trent, Okafor had said once about curiosity being different from hope, that you could be curious about something without being emotionally exposed to it. Just curious, like a scientist. I buzzed them up. I put my takeout on the counter. I waited by the door. When I opened it, the first thing I noticed was how much smaller my mother looked. I don't mean that cruelly. She had just compressed somehow. Age does that to some people. She was dressed nicely, a tan coat, her hair shorter than I remembered, mostly gray now. My brother was behind her. He'd gotten heavier. He was wearing a fleece jacket and he couldn't quite meet my eyes. My mother said my name again, like a question. I said, "Come in." They came in. They stood in my entryway looking around at my apartment with this expression that I recognized but couldn't immediately name. Then I realized they were recalibrating. They'd come expecting one thing and they were finding another. The condo is not extravagant, I'm not a showy person, but it's comfortable and considered. Everything chosen carefully, bookshelves full, good light, a few pieces of art on the walls. It looks like someone's home, not a guest room in someone else's life. They sat on my couch. I sat across from them in the armchair. I did not offer coffee. I was not being rude. Or maybe I was a little, but mostly I just needed this to move at whatever pace it was going to move. My mother talked for a while. There was some preamble, some surface-level catching-up language. "How are you? You look well. The apartment is beautiful." I nodded. I waited. Then she got to it. She said they'd been going through some things. She said my father's health was more complicated than they'd let on over the years. She said things had been difficult. She said, and this is the part where I had to keep my face very neutral. She said that they'd been hoping, maybe, that I might be willing to help. Not financially, she added quickly, which was interesting because help in my family has always been primarily financial when it needed to be. She said they just wanted to be back in my life. They wanted a relationship with me. They felt they had been. She paused for a long time here. She said they felt they had perhaps been too hard on me. When I was 20, too hard. I let the silence sit for a moment. My brother was still looking at the floor. I asked my mother, "What do you mean by that?" "Exactly." She said, "Well, asking you to leave like that." It wasn't, we were very upset. I said, "Upset about what?" She looked at me like I was being deliberately obtuse. Maybe I was, but I needed to hear it said. She said, "When you dropped out without telling us." I said, "I was 20 years old. I dropped out of a school I hated, and you threw me out of the house in February with $43. She said we were paying for that school. I said you had already stopped. I was covering my own tuition with my financial aid and my part-time job. You hadn't contributed anything since the first semester. You can verify that if you want. I kept the records. She didn't respond to that. I said, "What do you actually want?" My brother spoke for the first time. He said they wanted to have me back in the family, that they'd been thinking about it for a while, that life was short and the family was getting smaller and they wanted things to be different. I looked at him for a moment. This person who had stood in my doorway and watched me pack, who had never in 13 years picked up the phone. I said, "Okay, I hear you. Can I ask you something?" He said yes. I said, "In 13 years, why now?" My mother said, "Because we've had time to reflect." I said, "My aunt called me 6 years ago to tell me about Dad's health scare. I sent a card. Did you get it?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Did it occur to you to respond?" Silence. I said, "I want to understand what's different now from 6 years ago. What changed?" My brother shifted on the couch. My mother looked at her hands. And then something occurred to me that I hadn't expected. A piece of information, arriving quietly. 3 months earlier, a friend of mine in the financial world had mentioned, offhandedly, that a small commercial real estate company based in Naperville was in significant trouble. Over-leveraged, bad debts, a couple of properties going to foreclosure. The name of the company had registered somewhere in the back of my mind and then drifted. My brother works in commercial real estate. I looked at him and I knew. I said, "Is everything okay with work?" Something moved across his face. Very fast. He said, "That's not why we're here." I said, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just asking." My mother said, "We just want our family back. And here is the thing. I believe she meant it. Somewhere underneath whatever practical calculation had also driven them to my door on a Thursday in October, I believe my mother actually did miss me, actually did regret something, actually did want, in whatever imperfect and self-serving way she knew how to want things, to have a relationship with her daughter again. That mattered to me. It didn't change everything, but it mattered. I said, I appreciate you coming, and I need you to understand some things clearly because I'm not going to say them again, and I don't want there to be any confusion going forward. I said, I don't have money to lend. If that becomes a need, the answer is no, and it isn't personal. What I built alone, and I protect it accordingly. My brother said, That's not. I said, I know. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying it for clarity. I said, if we're going to have a relationship, it's going to be on honest terms, which means this conversation, the one we just had, cannot be the end of it. You said you were too hard on me. I need you to understand that what you did changed the entire shape of my life. I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because we can't move forward with a real relationship if you have a minimized version of what happened in your heads. Asking a 20-year-old to leave in February with $43 because she quietly dropped out of school is not being too hard, it's abandonment. That's the word. My mother had tears in her eyes. I said, I'm not trying to make you feel terrible. I'm trying to be honest with you, because if we do this, I want it to be real. My brother said, okay. My mother said, okay. My mother said, okay. We sat there for a little while longer. I ended up making coffee after all. Not because I forgave everything in that hour. I didn't. Forgiveness is not an event. It's a long, private process that happens on its own schedule, away from the people who need to see it happen. But I made the coffee because I was curious, and because Dr. Okafor had told me once that the bravest thing is often just to stay in the room. They left around 9. I stood at my window and watched my mother get into the passenger seat of a car I didn't recognize. My brother walked around to the driver's side. Before he got in, he looked up at my building window. I don't know if he could see me. I raised my hand anyway. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a while, not sleeping, just feeling the strange weight of a day that had cracked something open without breaking anything. The next morning I woke up at 6, made coffee, opened my laptop, and started on a proposal for a new client. The work was there. The life was there. Everything I had built, quietly alone, with no help and no inheritance and no safety net, was still there. Exactly where I'd left it. My mother texted the following week. A short message. She said she'd been thinking about what I said. She said she was sorry. Not just for that night. She said she was sorry for not seeing me clearly when I was young. For letting fear and embarrassment drive her parenting. She said she knew it was late. She said she hoped it still counted for something. I read it 3 times on the bus on my way to a client meeting. Then I put my phone in my pocket and looked out the window at the city passing by. All concrete and gray sky and people moving fast in opposite directions, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been quietly tight for 13 years. It counted. Even late, it counted. I'm not going to wrap this up neatly for you. Life doesn't do that, and I've found I don't trust things that wrap up too neatly. My relationship with my mother is still new and still fragile and still sometimes uncomfortable. My brother and I have had exactly 2 phone calls. My father has not reached out directly. There are things I've accepted and things I'm still working on, privately, in my own time, with my own therapist and my own journal and my own long Sunday runs through the park. But I am sitting in my office in Pilsen on a Tuesday afternoon, and through the window I can see a stretch of blue sky above the roofline across the street, and I have a business I built and a life I chose and a plant on my windowsill that has survived 6 years because I am, apparently, better at keeping things alive than I ever believed I could be. That's the part they didn't see when they watched me pack. They saw 20 years old in a duffel bag and $43. They didn't see who I was going to become when there was no one left to perform for, when it was just me and the numbers and the trail of truth that ledgers always leave. You cannot take that from a person. You can push them out the door in February, but you cannot take who they become in the cold. I know that now. I knew it then. I think, even if I didn't have the words for it yet. It was there in my chest already, quiet and stubborn, like a pilot light that no one ever managed to blow out. I walked out with $43 and I kept going. That was all. That was enough. I've thought a lot about what made my mother finally say the words, not just "we want you back," but the actual two words I had needed for 13 years. I'm sorry. She texted them on a Tuesday morning and I read them on a bus and I didn't cry, but something in my chest shifted in a way I still don't have a clean word for. Here's what I believe, and I'm not drawing this from any scripture or system of faith. I'm drawing it from watching what actually happens to people over time. The choices you make, how you treat the people who are vulnerable to you, how you use whatever power you have in a moment, those choices compound. They build a reality around you slowly, the way interest builds in an account you stopped paying attention to. My mother and my brother made a choice when I was 20 years old. They chose pride over me. They chose the idea of what I was supposed to be over who I actually was. And for 13 years, that choice sat in their lives, quietly accumulating its cost. I'm not saying they suffered enough. I'm not keeping score. What I'm saying is that nothing we do to other people disappears. It either gets repaired or it stays in the structure of who we are, warping things subtly, showing up in ways we don't always connect back to the original moment. I made choices too. I chose to keep going when stopping would have been so much easier. I chose to sit with the spiral notebook in a sandwich shop and follow the numbers because the alternative was despair and despair didn't pay my bus pass. I chose to go to Dr. Okafor's office every other week for years and do the uncomfortable work of understanding myself clearly, not as a victim, not as someone owed anything, but as a person with agency who was going to decide her own shape. That choice compounded too. It built the business. It built the condo. It built the capacity to open the door on a Thursday in October and stay in the room long enough to say hard, true things without cruelty. Intelligence, I've learned, isn't just about being fast with numbers. It's about being honest with yourself when honesty is inconvenient. It's about looking at a situation clearly instead of the way you wish it were. My family wasn't able to do that for a long time. I had to learn to do it without them, and that learning cost me something real. But it also gave me something I couldn't have gotten any other way, the knowledge that I can trust my own judgment, that I built what I built on something solid, that no one can take credit for who I became. Petra told me once, early on, when I was sleeping on her floor and feeling like the walls of my life had collapsed inward, "You're going to be okay because you're the kind of person who keeps their notebook." She meant the spiral one I was filling with inventory numbers at the restaurant. She meant it practically. But I've thought about it 100 times since, and I think she was saying something larger. The kind of person who pays attention when they don't have to. The kind of person who follows the truth even when nobody's watching and nothing is on the line yet. That's the only real asset that matters in the long run, not the condo, not the clients, the notebook. The willingness to stay honest and keep working even when the outcome is invisible. Everything else followed from that. Everything else always does.